Good evening and welcome to In Focus. Our guest this evening is Mr. Eric Miller, a Global Fellow at the Woodrow Wilson Center, who's in Colombo this week for a discussion, or a forum rather, on positioning Sri Lanka as a hub for multi-country consolidation services. Mr. Miller, thank you very much for making the time to talk to us on In Focus. Let me start off by asking you, when you say, in terms of trade, multi-country consolidation services, what exactly are you talking about?
Well, what multi-country consolidation is that when containers come into, say, the port of Colombo, they are not just transshipped, where the box comes off one ship and goes onto another ship. You actually open the container and you can do value addition, you can do quality control, do relabeling, do basic repairs. And what happens is that cargo can be taken out of that container and put into other containers so that they can go out to the world as full container loads. And so many countries now have the problem of shipping less than container load volumes of cargo, and that means they're essentially paying for air. What this does is it allows you to send full container loads to Rotterdam and Singapore and New York and other locations so that you reduce your overall cost of logistics while adding a lot of jobs and a lot of value addition for the Sri Lankan economy.
Do you really think that this is a niche that Sri Lanka can sort of exploit, given our sort of level of economic development?
Absolutely. You're already doing multi-country consolidation in the country. So what we're talking about here is really about going from good to great. And so now a lot of the multi-country consolidation is going to the Maldives, for example, because the Maldives doesn't generally have enough cargo for full container loads in many product categories. So that sort of reconsolidation for the Maldives is already happening. The question is, how do you exploit your success as what many would see as South India's greatest port and really become the center for multi-country consolidation for all things coming out of South Asia and going to the world?
When we're talking about trade facilitation, sort of in this way, one of the biggest questions that's being asked in Sri Lanka right now is Sri Lanka ready to get into, to be a more aggressive player, let's say, in global trade, entering into bilateral trade agreements? You're a specialist on trade and economic policy. Is there sort of a, how would you extrapolate on the relationship between economic policy reform and trade?
Well, in many ways, you have to look at them as integrally linked, because free trade agreements in and of themselves are not ends. They do not magically create results of more trade. What they are is gateways or facilitators to a broader outcome. And this means working on an economic strategy domestically at the same time as you are pursuing market opening. Market opening is fundamental because it means that your goods and services can get into those major international markets. But what you need is a strategy for working together as a country, public and private sector, and thinking creatively about, well, if we are going to negotiate a free trade agreement with China, how are we ensuring that our goods and services are already getting there? I spend a fair bit of time in Southeast Asia, and I've been to Vietnam, say, 4 times this year. Dilma tea is in every hotel room and on every table in restaurants in Vietnam. And so this is a Sri Lankan success story. The question is, how do you take more Dilmas and create those for those markets where you're negotiating free trade agreements? So free trade agreements are a beginning, not an end to the process.
When we're talking about multi-country consolidation services and making Sri Lanka sort of a hub, how important of a feature will trade agreements play in this?
Well, what trade agreements will do is they will increase the volume of trade coming to and through Sri Lanka. But what multi-country consolidation specifically does is it makes you into a hub where that cargo is not specifically entering the Sri Lankan customs territory. And so multi-country consolidation specifically is not dependent on free trade agreements. What this is about having a regime where that cargo can come in and go out to the world. Most of it is not staying here in Colombo, although one of the key benefits that having a multi-country consolidation regime will give you is those many small companies in Sri Lanka now that are having to pay less than container load fees to get their goods to world markets will actually be able to access this platform, which will give them really world-class rates in terms of shipping costs to their major markets. And so that means that they have to spend less of their resources on shipping, and that will make them more price competitive. And so it is all linked together, but multi-country consolidation itself is specifically not related to free trade agreements because, as I said, most of those goods aren't specifically entering the Sri Lankan customs territory. They are coming here, having value addition done, being repacked, and going to the world.
But free trade agreements would definitely contribute in positioning the country as a hub for multi-country consolidation services by increasing the volume of trade.
Absolutely. And also what free trade agreements do is definitely make countries more competitive. And so they will have to focus on upping their competitive game. It will also mean that the demand for shipping services to the countries with whom you have free trade agreements will grow. And so certainly on the demand creation side, you will get a big boost in terms of the need for these types of services. Multi-country consolidation is something that really happens in and around the port of entry, but the free trade agreements will allow those shippers that currently have to pay high fees to get their goods to world markets to be able to pay lower fees, and that will thus mean that you're sending more goods to those markets with whom you have free trade agreements. So the two work together synergistically.
At the beginning of the program, you said that this is really about taking Sri Lanka's multi-country consolidation regime from good to great. We'll have that when we come back. Welcome back to the program. We're in conversation with Mr. Eric Miller of the Woodrow Wilson Center. And we're talking about multi-country consolidation services. Now, you said that as far as Sri Lanka goes, you know, that going beyond the simple transshipment to actually adding value and positioning the country on global value chains. You said that the multi-country consolidation regime in the country is good, but it's about getting to the next level. What are the biggest obstacles that you see in going from good to great?
Right. So one of the things that our project is going to do is to undertake a regulatory assessment to see where it is that we are actually looking at difficulties in the country. And so what you're seeing now, for example, is the definition of multi-country consolidation is that a product must be going to Colombo plus 2 other locations. And so the question is, if you're having shipments going to 10 other locations as you build yourself into a hub, that's not possible under the current regime. So do we need a new definition? How does this go forward? And also there's the question of doing it within the port or outside of the port. Certainly the initial inclination is to do it inside of the port for operational simplicity, but that's a discussion that the Sri Lankan private sector and the Sri Lankan Ports Authority and the Sri Lankan government need to have. And so we will start with this regulatory mapping and gap assessment so that we can identify specifically where the obstacles are. And what this will do is also put this on the basis of what is going on in your major competitor markets. So Singapore, Dubai, even emerging places like Oman are becoming major competitors. And so the country now has a very good position in terms of transshipment, in terms of the competitiveness and efficiency of things like the South Asia global terminals and so on. So the question really is, how do we get that regulatory regime fixed in such a way that it can get even better? Because everyone is aware that there are a lot of challenges in terms of going from good to great. What we want to do is map those out and work constructively with the public sector and the private sector to bring that about. In other words, to realize finally that vision of Sri Lanka as a hub.
Ideally, what sort of policy or legislative reforms need to happen in order to realize that idea?
Right.
being a
So
hub?
my understanding is what happened in 2014 was there was a process of drafting a hub law, but there was not a lot of input from that. You see, what we've learned over the years is if you want to draft logistics policy, ask the people in the logistics business. And so we need them to work with us to identify where the specific obstacles are. We're not coming in from the outside and saying, you must do X and Y, because any great reform that any country has ever realized is something that they decide on themselves, that they build based on their own realities and their own circumstances.
And by talking to people who are actually in the sector.
Right.
Yeah.
I mean, it may seem like a radical concept, but if you want to do logistics reform, talk to people who are in logistics, who are logistics experts. And so what we are doing is to get that dialogue going and also work with the government in such a way that we will be able to move forth a package that we will see as a national consensus about what needs to be done. So one of the things we're going to do is we're going to take a group of Sri Lankans to Singapore and to Malaysia. Because if you want to be world class, you need to see what world class looks like.
Mr. Miller, when we're talking about the Indian Ocean region, or even in this sort of Asia-Pacific, South Asia, ASEAN, these regions, there are many hubs.
Yes.
As you mentioned, Dubai, Singapore, you mentioned Oman. We know that India has been putting in a lot of investment into its ports.
Yep.
A lot of the BIMSTEC countries, including Sri Lanka, which includes Sri Lanka, have also been investing a lot in this. Is there room in this sort of playing field for another hub?
I think there is room, because ultimately, you have the best location going. You really have the best location going. And so the question is about how do you take advantage of that? And so to me, yes, there is a lot of investment. But what I see as, for example, India's move to get rid of its cabotage laws as being about is a wake-up call to say, we are now in this position where we've got a good amount of transshipment business, but transshipment is very fickle. It moves very quickly. So the question is, we view this as an opportunity to say, oh, India has upped its game. India is changing its regime. What do we need to do in order to ensure that we are maintaining the port of Colombo as a world-class location and to take it even further? And so if you say, is there room or is there not room? Well, you have the best location, so it's about saying we're going to take advantage of it. This is not about saying, well, we've looked at it and we say there's not room for that. You take that territory and you make that your own. And Sri Lanka, if they put their mind to it, is eminently capable of becoming a great hub and really a dominant hub, because you've got the best location sitting right in the middle of the east-west shipping channel. And with India growing at 7% a year, everybody's going to want to come here.
It's an interesting sort of line of thinking as well, because many people say that given Sri Lanka's location, there is immense potential to be a global trade hub. And the opposition that we see to trade agreements in this sort of climate, people say is holding back the country from becoming that. We'll be talking about that and more on the other side. Welcome back to In Focus. We're in conversation with Mr. Eric Miller of the Woodrow Wilson Center. We were talking about positioning Sri Lanka as a hub for multi-country consolidation services, and we're also having discussion about Sri Lanka's potential to become a trade hub globally. Yep. And how much Sri Lanka's location already sets the country up to be a global trade hub. When talking about bilateral trade agreements, though, we see a lot of opposition. There is a fairly considerable anti-trade wave that people believe is building globally with the US's withdrawal from TPP negotiations, etc., and also the problems surrounding NAFTA and the renegotiating of NAFTA. Why is this? If trade is so beneficial, why the opposition?
Well, certainly there are some people who are concerned that not everybody has benefited from trade and that there aren't policies in place for adjustment. One of the things that I think has been a great failure globally is in the area of what's called trade adjustment assistance. So Verite Research here, with whom we do a lot of work in Sri Lanka as the Global Alliance, has done some great work on looking at a trade adjustment assistance framework for Sri Lanka. Because the question is how do you deal with the downsides of trade? But having not done that, people don't feel like trade is necessarily working for them in the way that it should.
This is one of the main accusations that faces Sri Lanka's negotiators as well when they're negotiating trade deals with their governments, that you're not thinking of how this trade agreement is actually going to benefit the people whom the government is meant to be serving. What do governments or the trade negotiators really need to do to ensure that that trade deal is a good deal and
right.
that it is working?
So step number one, you have to have a very clear sense of what your interests are. And so what are the sectors where you think you can benefit? And then what are the policies both within the trade agreement and outside of the trade agreement that need to be put in place in order to make that happen? Because you need a strategy in order to do that. And of course, when you negotiate a trade agreement, there will be things that emerge that you're not expecting. So there will be sectors and entrepreneurs that go out and create opportunities that you weren't necessarily thinking of. But in the main, what is your strategy in order to make sure that you are benefiting in particular areas? And that strategy has to be integral, from tax policy to investment policy to trade policy within that particular agreement. And so what you see from small countries is that their policy choices are different from large countries. The United States, as essentially the world's largest consumer market for a long time, has options that are not available to smaller countries. If you are Sri Lanka, though, you have to trade with the world. You are preternaturally inclined to be a trading nation. You see that throughout the nation's history. I was at the National Museum on Sunday and noted very strongly the trends in trade that go back to the 4th century BC, when currencies were first introduced on this island. And so you have that heritage. You have to trade. You're part of that system. But the question is, how do you make sure under the current circumstances, given the dynamics in China, how China subsidizes its products and sends it into world markets, how do you make sure that as you're dealing with the Japanese or with ASEAN or with Europe, that you are in fact taking advantage of it? And part of that is not just saying we're going to let the market function, although you do have to have a mechanism where the market needs to function, but you also need that partnership with governments and with the industry to say, this is how we're going to ensure that we take advantage of things. So do you need longer transition periods? Do you need adjustment assistance? Do you need training? Do you need all of these other sorts of factors? So as I said, trade agreements are a beginning, not an end to the country's process. And I think countries that have succeeded view things in that way.
Mr. Miller, just one final question for you before we wrap up. There is a feeling among many in Sri Lanka that one of the biggest obstacles when it comes to economic growth and prosperity, attracting more investment, enhancing trade with other countries, is that the level to which corruption has permeated society in Sri Lanka means that it is almost impossible to have a rules-based system. When, in your role as a trade and economic policy expert, how big of a role does combating corruption play?
Well, certainly corruption is not unique to any given country or to any given system. It is a challenge that exists all over the world. So what we've learned, though, on the trade reform front is that the use of technology, the use of systems that push for transparency is very important. So, for example, why is it important for cargo that's being imported into the country to get out of the port quickly? Because there's a saying that says, cargo at rest is cargo at risk. And what that means is that if your cargo is sitting there for 3 or 4 days, the incentive to find alternative means to remove that cargo from the port will increase. And so this is why you have to look at systems which are both consistent internationally, technology-based, and incentivize transparency as a way of moving things forward. There is no nirvana at the end of the process. People are people, and people are people everywhere, and you certainly see that. But if you find ways to reduce the opportunities for human intervention in areas that are not necessarily positive, then you are going to be able to effectively deal with that. And many, many countries around the world have dealt with that. Where I grew up in Canada, in the 1960s and the 1970s, one used to put a $20 bill in the middle of a package of customs documents. But the customs processes were automated, things changed, and that sort of practice went away. So too can it happen here. But it's about building the right mechanisms to ensure that the good outcomes are being incentivized and the bad outcomes are being pushed to the side.
Mr. Miller, thank you very much.
Thank you for having me on.
Enriching conversation. And I'm really looking forward to tomorrow's forum.
Well, we look forward to having you there, and feel free to ask the tough questions.
All right, so the forum's happening tomorrow, positioning Sri Lanka as a hub for multi-country consolidation services. We'll bring you an update on that forum at next week's In Focus. I'm Nadim Majid. Good night and good luck.